Welcome back to Introduction to Symbolic Logic. Exam 2 is coming up, and so here I want to discuss what will be covered in this exam and how you can prepare for it. Exam 2 is going to be all about TFL proofs. We have studied 12 basic inference rules, 9 derived inference rules, 3 proof strategies, as well as soundness and completeness. So these are the main topics that are going to come up, and I will say a little bit about each of these in what follows. So when it comes to TFL proofs, you should be able to construct proofs from premises. So we may give you the premises of an argument as well as the conclusion and ask you prove the conclusion from given premises. We may also ask you to prove a conclusion from no premises whatsoever, meaning we may ask you to show that a given sentence is a theorem. Now, when you construct these proofs, it will sometimes be necessary to make use of subproofs. So you should be able to construct subproofs and obey all the necessary constraints on the construction of subproofs. And in particular, sometimes it will be necessary to construct subproofs within subproofs, so make sure that you look at nested subproofs and the rules to follow when you construct these. Now, we have studied 12 basic inference rules. So for example, conjunction elimination, conjunction introduction, and so on and so forth. For each of these, you should be able to explain the informal motivation that we used to motivate why we wanted these inference rules in our proof system. And then for each of our 12 basic inference rules, you should also be able to distinguish between correct and incorrect uses. So we may show you a proof and ask you, is this a correct proof? If not, where are the mistakes? Can you point out the mistakes in this proof? And then, of course, you should also be able to apply these rules when you construct TFL proofs from scratch. After introducing the 12 basic inference rules, we discussed 9 derived inference rules. So these included reiteration, modus tollens, disjunctive syllogism, and so on and so forth. For each of these derived inference rules, you should be able to distinguish between correct and incorrect uses. So as before, we may show you a proof and ask you, can you point out the mistake? What's going wrong here? You should also be able to apply these proofs when constructing TFL proofs from scratch. And finally, you should be able to show that the derived inference rules are valid using only basic inference rules. So in other words, you should be able to prove that, say, disjunctive syllogism is a valid rule of inference. Now, we discussed 3 main proof strategies: backward planning, forward planning, and indirect proof. For each of these proof strategies, you should be able to explain how they work. So for example, we may ask you on the exam, suppose you wanted to apply backward planning in this scenario, what's the first step suggested by this strategy? You should also be able to choose one of these strategies in a given proof and decide which of the 3 strategies is more promising than the others. So we may show you the beginning of a proof and then ask you, which proof strategy would you apply to continue this proof? And then finally, you should be able to apply these proof strategies when you develop proofs from scratch. Now, we also discussed soundness and completeness, and you should be able what's meant by these terms. So when is a proof system sound and when is it complete? We then focused on the proof of the fact that TFL is sound, which you may recall is an inductive proof. So you should be able to explain the general structure and strategy of an inductive proof, and you should be able to explain the general strategy for showing that TFL is sound. Now, the whole soundness proof is very complicated, and we will not ask you to execute that entire proof in the exam. That would not be a reasonable exercise. We may, however, ask you to complete specific steps. in TFL's soundness proof. So we may show you an incomplete proof and ask you, what would you do to complete this proof of TFL's soundness? Now, what can you do to get ready for this exam? My first suggestion is to review and redo the practice quizzes, lecture responses, and problem sets. So I think here it is really important that you try to approach all of these exercises with a fresh eye. So do not merely reread your solutions that you have already submitted, but rather try to really redo these exercises. So look at an empty sheet and try to write up your answers from scratch once again. Now, in our textbook, you can find additional exercises that we have not yet discussed in class in the end of each chapter, and I do encourage you to solve these exercises and work through them. Now, while you do that, it is always helpful to work with other people, so I suggest to you to work with your team or other classmates that you have met during our lecture meetings. And then finally, if you have any questions at any point, get in touch, shoot me an email, come to office hours, and I'm happy to talk it through with you. Best of luck.